So, allow me first to introduce you now to our first speaker here in the room. In Hawthorne, Dr. Stan Korosi, sociologist and PA expert witness. Apart from his day job as an expert witness, he's also chair of the board of the charity that I lead, Parents Beyond Breakup. Meaning he's technically my boss, so please be nice to him, because I'll pay the price if you don't. Stan also sits on the board of PASG, the Parental Alienation Study Group. PASG, for those that are not aware, is the world's largest network of PA experts, and Stan is the only and Aussie representative on their global board. So love him or hate him, be nice to him because he's got the future of our families in his hands. Stan, let's kick off with what to you is parental alienation?
Oh, that's a very common question that keeps coming around. I feel like Copernicus, when I answer that. Centuries ago, Copernicus announced that the Earth was round and orbits the sun, not the other way around. And what I mean by that is that we keep asking the same question over and over again. We've known for more than 40 years what parental alienation is. The only thing that's really changed in that time is we get better and better at assessing what it is and what it isn't in any particular circumstance. So that's an age-old question. What is parental alienation? We've known what it is for more than 40 years. What keeps evolving is that we get better and better at assessing it. In any particular family situation, is it alienation, is it something else? The fact that the question keeps coming around is disturbing. And it mostly comes around because detractors of parental alienation, those who do not accept that there's a valid theory or practice, like to create so mayhem by seeding doubt. So imagine if I said, well, we don't really have a clear definition of family violence. I mean, there'd be an absolute uproar about that. And yet, the same false information is propagated about parental alienation. We know what it is. And it's basically, it's most simplest, an unjustified, unwarranted exclusion or rejection of a parent by a child engineered by the other parent. So it's a deliberate, premeditated action using known behaviours to convince the child that they should reject or resist a parent with whom they have a loving history behind them. We go on and on about those definitions. There's so many different definitions, but all come down to that central point: unjustified and unwarranted.
Okay, thanks for that. What's your position on PA? What do you base it on?
So there's a wealth of evidence, psychological, social, legal, that says that alienation is at the most highest level of social dynamic, and that it also manifests in family situations. We also know First Nations people are alienated from their land, from their culture, from country. So alienation has a very specific meaning to different social groups in Australia and around the world. So to say that alienation of itself as a concept doesn't exist is rubbish. We've known about it for a long, long time. To say that alienation doesn't exist in the family is the same thing. We know that it does. So my position is that parental alienation is not a belief system. It's an established theory and practice that's been developed specifically in family settings for 40 years, at least 40 years. The concept of alienation at a social level we've known about for centuries.
Thank you for that. What do you think needs to change for matters to improve, from your perspective as a sociologist?
Well, the whole concept of what is in a child's best interest is quite politicised. So the politics of a child's voice, for example, do children have a voice and a choice? How they're educated, what are a child's needs versus a child's rights? These are things that follow certain political lines. So one school of political thought is that children have what's called a mature child's voice or an adult voice. So if a child says that they've been sexually abused by a parent, it's treated as basically true because they made the claim. there's often little attention paid to whether they are under adverse adult influence. So the default position is it's habit. And so the parent or family member accused of it is deemed guilty by default. That is a political view that's transmitted through the legal system and then into the social science system when it comes to assessment. One of the things that needs to change is to reorient the idea of children's best interests, which is a very vague and politicised notion, into something a bit more specific on children's needs. And when you look at children's needs, they're pretty well defined in social and psychological terms that can be easily legalised in a family law setting. That's one of the things that needs to change. The other thing that needs to change is basically the politics of professional education. So, for example, for more than 10 years, we've had available in Australia an evidence-based remediation for alienated parent-child relationships. Only once did a case ever receive a family consultant's favourable recommendations against that remediation. Up until then, we were the dissenting voice in legal proceedings. And when we look at all the family assessments and, frankly, the role of independent children's lawyers, there's been a profound lack of understanding of the impact of an adverse narrative, negative narrative by one parent to a child, even a pre-verbal child. Now, the evidence is out there. The studies are out there. It's politicised professional development that skews knowledge in certain directions and excludes other knowledge. So that needs to be addressed. We also have a family law system that, to be blunt, is neither about the family nor the law. It rarely, if ever, enforces its own laws. The changes in 2024, some people argue with me about this one, removed the concept of family and certainly removed the last vestiges of a presumption of shared parenting. So you've got to ask yourself, well, what sort of family law actually is it? My reading of it is that it's actually a federal family violence law, and specifically a gendered family violence law. Now, there are major problems with dealing with family violence only through a gendered lens, because there's plenty of evidence to say it's bidirectional. Different forms of family violence, coercive control, psychological abuse, are used by different genders. And so by pitching 50% of the population as victims and the other 50% as perpetrators, we do enormous damage to our children. It's a lot more nuanced than that. In actual fact, the development of policy and law is following what we call a social determinants framework, which means, sex, gender, age, employment, where you live. The problem with that is that it fosters the gendered view of inequality and inequity, which arguably is certainly historically true. But when it comes to parental alienation is not associated very strongly with gender or age, or where you live, or your education. It's got nothing to do with those sorts of demographics that contemporary policymakers like to focus on. So we need a different framework and look at it differently in terms of how parental alienation and other forms of coercive control manipulate power in relationships and how they intersect with children's needs, with their human rights, with access to social resources. These cut across gender, age, employment, where you live, what size shoes you wear, the typical things that we use now.
Just listening to what you said, if we were to think of all the different stakeholders, from the parents themselves, their circles, in their private sphere, when we look at the professionals, and even wider afield when we look at policymakers, could you comment around incentives and consequences that lead to the current situation that we have? And to what extent that might need to change, if so on?
So some of you will have heard the term perverse incentives. Okay. Then I'll speak for Australia only here, but it's not, we're aware of it in international jurisdictions as well. There are perverse incentives. In other words, there are incentives for bad behaviour.
In a family law case some years ago, a judge commented on validating bad behaviour in the best interests of the child. In other words, they're facing situations in families where they feel forced to leave a child in the care and responsibility of a parent who's actually abused them. Because by some strange psychosocial or legal sophistry, that's in the child's best interests. I say that's rubbish, and the evidence would support me on that. So the perverse incentive is very clear. If someone makes an allegation of family violence, child sexual abuse, the other parent is automatically cut out of the child's life for as long as it takes. And so if that allegation is substantiated, in other words, it actually happened, well, maybe that's in the child's best interest. Okay? You have a violent, coercive, psychologically abusive person, a parent, who'd want their child brought up that way because we know the harm that it does. But what if they're not? The allegation itself is harmful, and it automatically triggers a shift in the child's attachment, if I can use that term in this setting, towards the parent who's making the allegation. So then what if the allegation is unsubstantiated? Well, you end up with a child who now hates the other parent, doesn't want to have anything to do with them, and believes they are their abuser. And typically, the courts are helpless to reverse that situation. So the perverse incentive is to make false and misleading allegations because that's how you get the child. And with the child comes the money. Okay? So there's a financial incentive, and that's how you go about doing it. Very easy to go in the system. Okay? And that's why I don't know if this is the case, but we see quite a few cross allegations of parental alienation and family violence. Because from a game theory point of view, you have to match the allegation. You've got to get the judges to do some serious work here. So they're going to have to figure out which allegation has the most substance and who is the most plausible parent. So here's another thing that we need to deal with in the perverse incentives is in the assessment of these cases and in the judgment of these cases based on my reading of quite a few reasons of judgment. To be blunt, it's the parent who performs the best, not necessarily the parent who tells the truth. Because there is no truth or lies in family law because there is no perjury, technically. So it's your performance that counts. So that's a strange way to go about figuring out the child's best interest. So the perverse incentive goes to those who are the most articulate, who've done the most internet research, who've ticked the most family violence boxes, okay, and who get in first with an allegation. If you get in first with an allegation, you get the family violence order. You get the child.
This is something interesting though, which is that there is no such thing as perjury in the family courts. So what you're saying is that there is an incentive potentially for a parent to lie or mislead the court to gain advantage, and that it happens both ways from your earlier comments. But it's curious to me that the court itself is not able, therefore, to then provide consequences. I mean, are you able to comment on how that phenomenon occurs and why you think it is the way it is?
I'll use a brief example, perhaps to illustrate the point. Legal experts will probably disagree with me about the perjury, but in a way, the role of the family court is not to decide if there's a lie or a truth. Its job is to decide what is in the child's best interest. However, that's conceptualized or defined. So in a case in which I was involved, we had a parent who made serious allegations of family violence, had a very detailed affidavit. There were several parts of the affidavit where they claimed certain forms of violence occurred by the other parent that were frankly impossible. Couldn't happen, practically and geographically. In other words, the other parent simply wasn't in Australia at the time the alleged family violence took place. Was that parent lying? were they mistaken? Because it's possible to be mistaken. Family violence is quite traumatic, and in traumatized victims, for want of a better term, often have trouble remembering correct times and dates. But they do have other means of correlating events with other events, for example. In this case, there was no such explanation. Now, the focus of that court was not on whether this person lied. The focus was on whether there was family violence of a type that would affect the child's best interests. They decided there wasn't, and the rest is history. But that's how difficult it is. In a jurisdiction, it doesn't work with truth or lies. So it doesn't really, in my experience, have a way of determining if an allegation is false and misleading. Now, a false and misleading allegation, there are some studies done on this in Australia and international. The incidence is actually very high. And so a false and misleading allegation is designed to skew the expert assessment of the situation and therefore the judicial outcome if you get that far. Because again, the types of family violence we're talking about leave no bruises, they leave no physical injuries. These are psychological and emotional manipulations. They're all down to the narratives that are used. And again, they're down to the performance of it.
Actually, it's interesting that you brought up the subject of violence. I did read on your personal blog a little while ago that you made a reference to something which is little known, I guess, which is proxy murder, which is murder by suicide through parental alienation. Would you care to say a few words about that? Because that was quite interesting, and it's a lesser known form of violence that occurs quite often. Actually.
I've been working with I've met in equal numbers. Universally, they suffer their own trauma. There is something quite uniquely traumatizing of being cut out of your child's life. The child whose nappies you changed, whom you fed, whom you loved and took to school, etc., went camping with, taught how to ride a bike. This child now loathes you. That's a bitter pill for any parent to swallow. So we do know that deaths from suicide are universally skewed towards men. Far more men, to be blunt, kill themselves than women do. Women will attempt suicide, but are less likely to die from it than men. Men usually choose far more fatal means because they decide they're going to die for all sorts of reasons. So there's a psychosocial suicide category called suicide that results from disruptions to family relationships, from separation and divorce. Now, I will claim that a substantial but an unknown portion of that category is actually due to the deliberate rupture of family relationships. Now, we need to do studies to demonstrate that. But based on my experience within parents beyond breakup, dads in distress, mums in distress, grandparents, my work with parents, I suspect that a very high proportion that actually is. Now, when a parent, and mostly a man, decides to try suicide in the context they've been alienated from a child, it's very often at the end of devastating repeated allegations of family violence which are unsubstantiated, child sexual abuse, and they've lost their job, and they actually could a school teacher, a child protection worker, family lawyer, I could go on. And so my view is, based on the work that I've done, they don't come for that idea themselves. They are actually coerced into believing that they have no other option but to stop the pain, that they are a worthless human being, a hopeless parent. So in women's cases, their trauma is quite different. In my research and experience, women tend to internalise social models of what it is to be a good mother and a good woman. And so their female peer groups tend to reinforce the fact that if you don't have a relationship with your child, it's your fault, you've done something wrong. It's a strong cultural basis for that in some countries. So they often simply withdraw from the fight because that's what it is. It's a fight. For men, it's a combination of male shame that they've failed at the task of being a man, of being a father. They can't take it anymore. And death is the way out. So I don't think that they thought of it themselves without being in the context that gave the thought, currency, we gave it energy. So yes, I would say that in alienation situations, it could be considered a form of proxy murder. And as a precedent to that, I think it was last year, the Victorian police decided to reopen cases of suicide by women where there'd been a family violence involvement. And they wanted to reclassify them as family violence deaths. Well, I say, good on you. Let's reopen the suicide deaths of men and women who have been alienated from their children. Let's call them coercive controlling family violence deaths. Same thing.
Okay, thank you for that, Stan. And actually, just as a comment there, we know from the Australian Institute of Health and Wellbeing that the majority of male suicides in Australia are related to relationship and family breakdown. So it's an interesting point where parental alienation intersects with that. As we approach the end of our talk here, before we move on to our second guest, I think what would be really useful for those viewing online and here in the room today is what is it that I can do, whether I'm a professional or whether I'm a parent, whether it's about my personal situation, a case I'm working on, or just societally, other than taking part in this conversation, at least the policy framework, what is it that I could be doing?
One word, vote. There's a federal election on this year. Choose who you vote for very carefully. Okay? At the highest level, parents who've been alienated from their children are a silenced, marginalised group of people who, at least until now, haven't had a voice. So you can exercise your voice at the polling booth. So choose the candidates that have a family policy there that favours family relationships. Equally with children's safety. So that's the first thing. The other thing is silencing is the worst punishment of all. When you are silenced and you silence yourself, that's when the real damage gets done. And so we as a group, as a class, as individuals have to speak up about this and hold the people who supposedly assess the children's best interests to account. And our politicians and lawmakers and policymakers as well. Every parent faces a moral dilemma. You can go broke in the family court, morally, financially, in every way possible. And I've known parents who are willing to do that just to demonstrate that they've done everything they possibly could for their children. I've also known parents, for equally valid reasons, who have to walk away. And there's many reasons, amongst other things, their mental health. The point is, in every way, in your own individual way, there's a way of taking a stand. Okay? And at the highest level, political charities, dictatorships have been overthrown by a few people who spread the word. And eventually it becomes a powerful movement and over they go. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Stan.